The Grinnell family buried 4 children in 7 years, yet the townsfolk swore they kept growing. Small faces pressed against frosted windows, laughter echoing down halls emptied by grief. They said the Grinnells were holy folk until the gravekeeper noticed something strange. Every cradle was buried the same day as every coffin, and when one was dug up, the wood was wrong, the smell was wrong, and something inside was still moving. No one could agree on what had been reborn, only that it never came back right. The first thing anyone noticed was the silence, not the kind that follows sorrow, but the kind that settles when something unnatural is near. The Grinnell home, tall and proud on the edge of town, held its fourth funeral in as many years. Black lace draped the windows, candles burned low behind heavy curtains, but no one saw a body arrive, no hearse, no casket, just a wooden cradle carried between the arms of Mr. Grinnell and his wife, the lace drawn tight across its top as if to shield it from the sun. Miss Delaney, who lived 2 farms down, said she saw them lowering it into the ground just after dawn. The priest didn't speak a single word, and when she asked him later why he looked pale as salt, he muttered something about eyes that blinked through the lace. Inside the Grinnell house, the morning room stayed locked, but the maid, who only lasted 3 days before running off barefoot down the road, claimed the wallpaper had been torn down and replaced with sheets of cloth, each one stained with tiny handprints. She swore the cradle rocked on its own when no one touched it. The sheriff, when asked why he hadn't investigated, only spat and said he wouldn't go poking into grief no man could understand. But the town began to whisper that the children had never truly died, that the crying never stopped, and that in the hour before dawn, if you passed the Grinnell place and held your breath, you'd hear someone cooing lullabies in a language no one knew, and something older than a child humming back. The ledger at the township office was kept in perfect script, updated in iron gall ink by a clerk who prided himself on precision. Under deaths for the year of 1864, the name Caleb Grinnell, aged 6 months, appeared, followed a year later by Mercy Grinnell, aged 3. Then came Elias in 67, and finally Ruth in 71. 4 names, 4 entries. Each one listed natural causes. But when old Harlan Fitch, the former doctor who had served the area for nearly 3 decades, was asked why none of the death certificates bore his signature, he hesitated. He said he'd never been summoned to the Grinnell home for any of the children, never examined their bodies, never confirmed their passing. The clerk, unnerved, asked who had signed the reports. Harlan shook his head and pointed out that they were initialed only 3 faint letters in a hand no one recognized. Meanwhile, the cemetery caretaker, Lester, admitted in hushed tones over cider that he had never buried a body for the Grinnells, only Cradles. Weighted, yes, he said, rubbing the heel of his hand against his eye, heavy enough, but not like a child, off balance, always off balance. He paused, then added something else. The Cradles were buried deep, deeper than any infant coffin needed to be. Each time, he was paid in cash and asked not to return for a week. That part, he obeyed. Still, he remembered standing near the fresh earth one morning and hearing the faintest sound. Not crying, humming, low and tuneless. The next week, it was gone. When someone finally tried to contact the county coroner, the letter came back unopened. The address had burned down years ago, but the clerk, who couldn't sleep after noticing the same black lace on each funeral notice, did something reckless. He went to the archives and pulled up the birth registry. There, the Grinnell children were listed with precise dates, births matching the deaths by exactly 1 year, as though each child had lived twice, as though the second life had ended at the same age, in the same room, under the same veil of silence. The midwife's name was Alma Crick, and for 12 years she lived alone at the edge of the marsh, her windows covered with brown paper, and her door marked with a red handprint faded by sun and time. She hadn't spoken to anyone in town since the night she fled the Grinnell home barefoot, streaked with something dark that wasn't all blood. People said she'd gone mad, that she rocked an empty cradle and whispered to it, that she carved tiny names into the walls of her kitchen and crossed them out in chalk. But when her niece found her on a cold February morning, seated upright, with her eyes open and unmoving, the silence finally cracked. She'd left behind a single page inside a tin bread box. The handwriting was shaky, like it had been written while hiding. It wasn't a confession, more a warning. She never named the Grinnells, but she wrote of a birth that should not have happened. She said the mother never pushed, not once, and yet the child came anyway, slid out like it knew the way back. She said it was already breathing before it left the womb, that it opened its eyes in the dark and stared not at her, but through her. She wrote of the room being wrong, too cold for summer, but the walls sweating. She said the floorboards warped beneath her feet, and when she looked down, there was mud, not blood mud, thick and black, coming up through the seams. The worst part, she said, was the sound. The baby didn't cry, it laughed. A dry, rasping laugh that didn't belong to lungs so new. She tried to leave, but the father held the door. He said, "You helped the last three, you'll help this one too." Alma said she bit him hard enough to taste copper and ran. She never went back. Not for her things, not for her wages, not for the silver locket she wore every day of her life. The final line on the page was scrawled across the bottom like it had been added in a panic. They're not being born, they're being let back in. Her name was Letty Bramble, just 17, sent from a neighboring town to help keep house after the last maid left without taking her shoes. The Grinnells paid well and spoke little ideal, her mother had said, but Letty knew something was off the moment she stepped into the nursery. It wasn't the smell, though it lingered like rain on copper, nor was it the silence, which hung too heavily for a home with children. It was the cradle, white wood, curved like a boat, with carvings that didn't match any prayer she'd ever read. Her first night, Letty rose to stoke the fire and heard it. A slow creak, back and forth. She paused on the landing. Wind? No. The windows were shut tight, the air thick. She crept toward the nursery door and pressed her ear against the grain. The creaking grew steadier. No crying, no murmurs, just the lull of movement, as though an unseen hand was coaxing something back to sleep. She opened the door. The cradle rocked in perfect rhythm. Empty, the room still. She stepped closer. The floor didn't groan beneath her feet, it pulsed. She froze. From the corner of her eye, she saw the mobile, small, handmade dolls spinning. No draft, no breeze. She reached out and stopped the cradle with her hand. It trembled beneath her palm, like something resisting. The next morning, she asked Mrs. Grinnell, who had been in the nursery. The woman's lips barely moved when she said, "Only memory." That night, the sound returned. She didn't go near the door. Instead, she lay awake until the creaking stopped at dawn. On the third night, she placed a tin cup of flour on the floorboards to catch any step. In the morning, the cradle had moved again. The flour was untouched. Letty lasted 5 nights. On the 6th, she packed her things before sunup and left her wages on the dresser. But before she left, she crept once more to the nursery. She opened the door slowly. The cradle rocked on its own. Inside it lay something swaddled in black lace. It breathed. Just once. She ran without screaming. Elias Grinnell took his seat like he'd always belonged there, 3rd row from the front, next to the window where the ivy clawed its way through the cracks. Miss Tallow, the schoolmistress, paused when she read his name from the roll call. Not because it was unusual, but because she remembered writing it down 6 years ago. Elias Grinnell, age 7, drowned in the well behind his family's home. His funeral had been held in the chapel with the cracked bell, and she had pressed a white flower into his mother's hand. But now he sat in her classroom, hair combed neatly, same freckled cheeks, same dimple on his left side. Only his eyes were wrong. Too still, too knowing. When she asked him his age, he replied 7. Again, the children noticed first. "He don't blink right," whispered one girl. "He stares too long," said another. One child wet himself when Elias turned and smiled during a reading of Psalms. His voice was steady but hollow, as if reading something he didn't believe but had memorized long ago. Miss Tallow wrote to the Grinnells, No reply came. When she asked him directly, Elias said he'd never been here before, but he knew which drawer held the chalk. He drew the school layout from memory, including the trapdoor in the floorboard no one used anymore. The other students began to avoid him, not because he spoke cruelly, he barely spoke at all, but because he seemed to know things. He finished their sentences. He called them by names only their parents used at home. Once, he told a girl her baby sister would not make it through the winter. A week later, the fever came. Miss Tallow asked the minister to bless the room, and when he arrived, Elias would not meet his gaze. He sat quietly, with his hands folded, while the prayer was read, but the oil lamp above his desk flickered the entire time. After class one day, Miss Tallow took his drawing, a crude sketch of the well behind the school, the one sealed in with bricks, and showed it to the groundskeeper. He went to check. The bricks had been pushed out from the inside. When she returned to the classroom, Elias was gone. Just gone. But the next morning, he was back in his seat, smiling faintly. She told the children to go home early that day and never reopened the school. Years later, when she lay dying, Miss Tallow whispered something no one could make sense of. They named him twice, and now he remembers. It was the kind of doll only rich families gave stitched linen body, hand-carved face, button eyes sewn too close together, and a mouth painted in a soft, strange curve that didn't quite smile. The girl who brought it to church said she got it as a gift from Mrs. Grinnell for helping tend the garden. Her name's Mercy, the child said. She don't like the sun. The doll never left her hands. Not during the sermon, not even during communion. She tucked it in her shawl like it might catch a chill. After service, while the pastor's wife offered cider on the lawn, the doll slipped from the girl's lap. It landed on the grass with a soft thud, its little bonnet coming loose. That's when the pastor's wife knelt to pick it up and froze. Her hand trembled as she brushed the yarn aside. Then her fingers reached for the hair stitched onto the doll's scalp. It wasn't yarn, it was hair. Real hair, coarse at the roots, fine at the ends. The exact shade of ash blonde worn by the fourth Grinnell child, Ruth, buried at age 5. The pastor's wife let out a sharp, small sound and collapsed into the cider table. They said it was heat stroke, but the way she clutched at her throat told a different story. Later, when the doll was taken to the rectory for safekeeping, the pastor examined it under lamplight. He found more than hair. The stuffing inside wasn't wool or straw, it was shredded paper, brittle and stained. He pulled one scrap free, smoothed it with shaking hands, and saw a name, Elias Grinnell, age 5, cause of death, N.A. The handwriting matched the same strange initials found in the town's birth ledgers. There were more papers inside, all names, all children, all Grinnells, all marked let in instead of born. That night, the rectory cat screamed for an hour and wouldn't step near the hearth. The pastor tried to burn the doll in the stove. The flame went out twice. The third time, the doll caught, but it didn't burn. It melted, like wax, black and slow, and something inside it hissed. The pastor didn't speak again for days. The doll's ashes were buried behind the chapel wall in a jar sealed with wax. The next Sunday, the girl came to church empty-handed, but whispered during the sermon. When asked what she was saying, she replied, "She says thank you. She liked her new cradle better anyway." No one could ever quite place it. That smell, it met you at the threshold of the Grinnell house, like a greeting whispered just behind the teeth, cloying, soft, and sick. Some said it was flowers. Lilies left too long in water. Others said it was closer to fresh-turned earth, like a grave still damp, but not yet settled. The odd part was, the Grinnells kept no garden, no flower beds, no herbs drying in the kitchen, like proper folk, and yet the scent clung to every corner of the house, threading through the wainscot, settling into the hems of drapes. One widow, invited for tea, described it as a church funeral held underground. Another guest claimed it reminded her of the spring thaw back home, when the ground gave up what had been hidden under snow. No matter how clean the floors or polished the silver, the house always smelled like something waiting to be buried, or worse, something dug up too soon. It wasn't just the smell, it was what followed. Boots left by the front door were found wet at the soles. Mice chewed through flour but left the dirt untouched. The chimney, though never used, scattered black flakes in the parlor like dried petals. Visitors noticed that no matter the season, the air in the Grinnell home was too damp. Wallpaper curled at the edges, frames warped, and sometimes, if you looked close at the seams of the floorboards, you'd swear something dark pulsed just beneath them, like a wet breath trying not to rise. One afternoon, a tax assessor came by, clipboard in hand, all business and no superstition. He left within 15 minutes, pale and stammering, and handed in his resignation a week later. Said the place had too much underneath it. What he meant, no one asked. When the housekeeper tried to scrub the wood with vinegar and salt, the rag came up red. She said it was just stain, just old cherry wood. But she didn't go back the next day, or ever. What remained unspoken was this. The smell grew strongest in the nursery, especially near the cradle, especially when no one was there. One neighbor, passing by after dusk, swore she saw fog slipping out from under the front door, low and crawling, like mist over graves. She didn't stop walking. The Grinnell home was always warm, always welcoming in its way. But no one stayed long, and everyone who left carried a piece of that scent with them, clinging like regret. They called him Mr. Pike, though no one knew if that was his given name or a nickname born of his slanted gait and quiet ways. He'd been the caretaker of Grinnell's small hillside cemetery for longer than the trees could remember, outlasting the minister, the alderman, and 3 generations of men who never asked what he did after sundown. Pike had a ledger, not the church's his own, bound in cracked leather and kept wrapped in oilcloth under the floorboards of the tool shed. He opened it only once, when the new priest came asking why the land behind the West Ridge had begun to sink. Because there's more in the ground than what's written in the books, Pike said, tapping the ledger like it had a heartbeat. He flipped it open, past pages yellowed with mildew, until he came to the Grinnell name. The first entry was for Ruth. Date of death, grave location, fee paid, and then, beside it, written in smaller script, duplicate plot, East Grove, unmarked. The priest raised his brow. Pike didn't blink. Each time a Grinnell child died, he said, voice thin as dried roots, I was asked to dig 2 graves, one for the funeral, one for the other thing. The priest asked what he meant. Pike just shrugged. Some things ain't for the pulpit. He described how Mr. Grinnell paid in coin that never stayed warm, no matter how long it sat in the palm. He remembered being told not to use holy tools, not to speak their names while digging, and never to mark the second graves with stone or cross. They wanted the dirt to forget, Pike muttered. But dirt, he said, remembers everything. Over the years, he noticed strange things. The marked graves sank fast, like something inside pulled downward with hunger. The unmarked ones stayed too still, too firm, like they weren't graves at all but locks. He tried once to open one, years later, when whiskey and nightmares tangled in his chest. He dug only halfway before the soil turned black and soured his hands. The smell that rose up nearly took his breath. He never tried again. The priest asked if anyone else knew. Pike said the ledger never lied, and that the ground beneath Grinnell was full of second chances, chances that never should have been given. When asked why he'd kept the secret so long, Pike said nothing. He only turned the page. There, beneath the last Grinnell child's name, was a line freshly written. No date, no age, just 2 words. Coming soon. The hearth had always smoked too much, even in winter, when every house in town stoked fire to keep the frost from creeping in through the nails. But the Grinnell hearth gave off more than heat. It gave off a strange, sweet burn, like dried herbs and scorched sugar. When the mason arrived to repair the cracked stone and flue, he worked with his sleeves rolled high, grumbling about moisture and rot. He was halfway through pulling up the old brickwork when his trowel struck something that didn't give like stone. It made a hollow knock, like bone on metal. He dug slowly, not wanting to damage what he thought was a rusted pipe. But then it rolled free, and he held it in his hand, small, curved, pale, a femur, Child-sized, the room went quiet, the kind of quiet that thickens the air. The Grinnells weren't home. The mason should have left, called someone, anyone. But curiosity, or maybe something worse, took hold. He kept going. Beneath the stone lay more than mortar. There was a shallow cavity lined with ash, but not the soft gray of wood. This ash was darker, mixed with something that glittered tiny bits of enamel, teeth, too small to be from adults. He found more bones, half a jaw, a fragment of rib, all charred, but not fully, like whatever had burned them hadn't finished the job. At the very bottom of the cavity, pressed into the scorched soil, was a coin, not minted, hand-stamped. One side bore a child's name, Ruth, the other, a symbol no one could later identify. The mason staggered back, wiping his hands on his apron, though the soot wouldn't come off. It stayed under his nails, in the creases of his palms, as if the hearth had marked him. He wrapped the bones in a cloth and left them at the rectory, refusing to speak of it again. That night, smoke poured from the Grinnell chimney, though no fire had been lit. The neighbors saw it and said nothing. The next day, the mason quit his work, packed his tools, and left town without collecting his pay. Inside the Grinnell house, the hearth was resealed. The stone looked newer, cleaner, too clean, and yet the smell remained sweet and wrong, like something trying to pretend it had never lived at all. The baby's cradle was moved closer to the fireplace that week. Mrs. Grinnell said it was warmer there. When asked about the repairs, she smiled faintly and said, "We had to fix the mouth. It was letting things out." Dr. Olcott was not the kind of man to spook. He had delivered stillborns in candlelit barns, amputated limbs during winter storms, and stitched wounds while husbands wept outside the door. When the Grinnell boy, Samuel, barely 3, was declared dead after a sudden, unexplained fever, it was Alcott who was called to sign the certificate. The body was already laid in the parlor, pale and tucked beneath an embroidered quilt stitched with strange, looping symbols. Too clean, Alcott thought. The skin had no sign of sweat, no flush of illness, no visible trauma, just stillness. The kind of stillness that felt rehearsed. The parents stood behind him, silent, the mother's hand resting on her husband's forearm like an anchor. Alcott asked if he could check the body one last time before the burial. They hesitated, then nodded. He lifted the child's eyelids first. The pupils were not cloudy. They should have been. Then he pressed gently at the throat. No pulse, but the skin there wasn't cold. Cool, yes, but not what he expected. He unbuttoned the child's shirt and placed his hand over the heart. Nothing, and yet the chest was pliable. The belly warm, too warm. He asked when the boy had passed. "Yesterday morning," Mrs. Grinnell whispered. Her voice shook, but her eyes did not. Alcott asked if the body had been kept chilled. "Only prayer," she answered. He leaned closer. The boy's lips were dry, but not cracked. The fingers curled slightly inward, not stiff. He touched the wrist and flinched. A tremor. So faint he might have imagined it, but he'd seen death before. This wasn't it. "I need to take him," he said. "There's something wrong here." Mr. Grinnell stepped forward, not angry, just firm. "He is where he belongs." Alcott turned to protest, but Mrs. Grinnell had begun humming a slow, lullaby tune that seemed too old for the room, too slow for her mouth. He stepped back. The child's eyes were open again. Alcott hadn't opened them. He hadn't even touched the face again, but the eyes stared now, not at the ceiling, not at his mother, at Alcott, wide, unblinking, and yes, wet. He left, told the church to proceed, and for the first time in years, he refused to sign a certificate, said he was too ill to attend the burial. When asked later what he'd seen, he only said this: that boy was not done with breathing. That night, something knocked once at his door. Just once, but when he opened it, the front step was wet like a child had stood there barefoot, dripping. The Grinnells were known for their roses. Even in the bitter grip of February, when every other garden lay dead beneath frost, theirs bled color, crimson, violet, sickly white. The vines curled like fingers against the fence posts, stubborn and clawed, pushing through snow like they remembered warmth no one had offered them. But it wasn't the roses that made the children uneasy. It was the far back corner of the yard, where nothing was planted but something always grew. There, the earth was darker, softer, and always damp, even after weeks without rain. That's where Jonah, the grocer's boy, wandered one afternoon, chasing his dog. The pup had darted under the fence, yipping like it smelled something sweet. Jonah followed, knees muddy, face pink from the cold. The dog stopped at a bare patch of soil dotted with small, waxy stems. Jonah knelt to touch one. It was pale, almost translucent, with veins like tiny roots. As he brushed the dirt aside, he uncovered something that should not have been there. A tooth, small, white, and perfectly intact except for the hair. A fine red strand was still caught around the root, like it had been tugged out, not lost. He dropped it. The dog growled low. Then Jonah saw more. Dozens, half buried, clustered like pebbles around the plants, some dull, some fresh. He reached again, this time pulling up a stem, and with it came something worse, a piece of jaw, slick with soil, socket still cradling a molar. He screamed. The dog bolted, and from the back porch, Mr. Grinnell was already walking toward him, slow, measured, a spade in one hand. He didn't yell, didn't run, just walked, as if this moment had always been scheduled. Jonah stumbled back over the fence, teeth clutched in his pocket like proof he hadn't dreamt it. He told his mother. She told the church. But by the time the elders arrived, the corner had been neatly turned, earth flattened, a rose bush planted in the middle like a lid. Mr. Grinnell smiled and offered tea. The elders declined. No one went back. But weeks later, the roses near that patch began to change. The petals frayed at the edges, curling like they'd been scorched, and the thorns thickened, blunter, as if they were no longer meant to prick but puncture. Children whispered that if you listened close after dark, you could hear crunching, not roots, not bugs, something else, like the garden was chewing. One girl said she saw a finger poking from the dirt, pale and child-sized, wearing a silver ring she swore had once been hers. When asked what the Grinnells grew in their yard, Jonah answered without blinking, "They're not growing flowers, they're feeding them." Every evening, just before the sun slips behind the pines, the attic window at the Grinnell house fills with gold light, and every evening someone is there, standing motionless behind the warped glass, silhouetted in lace and shadow. The figure does not move, does not wave, but always watches. At first, the neighbors assumed it was Mrs. Grinnell, until someone mentioned the shape wasn't right, too tall, too thin. And then the schoolteacher said she saw the same face there when she was a child, 30 years ago, before the current Grinnells even lived there. That's when the town stopped asking questions and started crossing the street instead. But one boy, Elijah, from the apothecary's family, dared to ask directly. He knocked on the Grinnell door just after supper and asked Mrs. Grinnell, polite as could be, "Who is the woman in your attic?" She smiled gently, the kind that doesn't touch the eyes, and replied, "There's no one upstairs, dear, just dust and rafters." But that night, Elijah crept out with a looking glass. From the field behind their home, he fixed the scope on the attic window, just as the last light hit. The figure was already there, but closer now. Not at the window, but behind it, staring down through the glass, mouth slightly open, as though waiting for someone to speak first. Her skin looked gray. Not old, exactly more like paper left in a fireplace too long. Her dress was out of time, high-collared and cinched, like something buried with buttons all the way up the spine, and her hands didn't hang right. One tilted inward, limp. The other scratched lightly at the glass, slow and rhythmic, as if marking days on an invisible wall. Elijah dropped the scope. He swore he saw her blink. The next morning, he told the pastor. The pastor told the Grinnells, and the Grinnells laughed. But later that week, Elijah's mother found him burning his toys in the yard. Said the attic woman told him to make room. That night, Mr. Penrose visited with a journal from the old land office. The house, he explained, had been built over the remains of a much older home, one that belonged to a woman accused of returning infants to the earth. Her name was withheld. Only her initials remained, M.E.G. A note beside it read, "Her bones were never found. Her mouth was stitched shut. But some say the attic smells faintly of herbs, that the boards creak at night like someone pacing, and that if you stand too long beneath that window, you'll hear breathing that doesn't belong to you." They gathered at St. Rosens just before noon, the pews full, the bells silent. The Grinnells brought the child wrapped in white wool, silent at first, then mewling, then howling the moment the church doors shut behind them. Mrs. Grinnell clutched the bundle tighter, smiling at the congregation with a fixed, breathless grace. Father Alden stood waiting beside the stone font, its basin already filled, though no one remembered seeing it done. The water looked calm, still. The air inside the church, however, shifted like a storm was waiting behind the rafters. The ceremony began like any other readings, soft hymns, anointing with oil, but when Father Alden dipped his fingers into the water to bless the child, he paused. His hand hovered just above the surface, and his lips moved with the words, but none of them came out. The baby's wail rose higher, more frantic, and Mrs. Grinnell stepped forward without invitation, offering the child into the priest's arms with an urgency that wasn't desperation but insistence. The priest hesitated, then took the child, lowered him toward the water, and just as the infant's brow touched the surface, the font trembled. The water didn't splash, it sank. Its color darkened, like ink spilling beneath the surface. Then it turned gray, thick, slow, like ash and milk stirred together. The baby went silent. So did the church. Father Alden stared into the basin, as if something inside had caught his reflection, but not his own. Then, without a word, he backed away, still holding the child. His face had changed, not with fear, but recognition. He handed the baby back and turned from the altar without finishing the rite. He left the church in his robes, without his coat, and walked barefoot into the woods beyond the cemetery. He was never seen again. Some say he carved a circle of crosses into the trees before he vanished. Others say they found his rosary wound around the font like a noose. Mrs. Grinnell said nothing, simply wiped the baby's brow and returned to her seat, as if nothing had occurred. But weeks later, the other priests sealed the font, drained it, scrubbed it. Still, the stain remained. When questioned, the bishop said only that the sacrament had not taken, that sometimes the soul refuses water. The child grew quickly after that, too quickly. The neighbors noticed he spoke in full sentences before he could walk, that his eyes never wandered like other infants they fixed on people, followed them, studied. One Sunday, a woman found him sitting at the empty font, dipping his fingers into the dried basin and muttering in a tongue she didn't know but felt in her bones. And when she asked his name, he smiled and said, "Again." It began with little things, a girl tracing charcoal flames on the orphanage's stable wall, whispering, "It was red like this," but louder. When asked what she meant, she blinked slowly and said, "The curtains caught first." But the Grinnell house had no curtains, not anymore. The boy they called Thomas, though his eyes seemed to reject that name, began humming one afternoon during chores. The tune was old, halting, the notes uneven like marching boots over gravel. The tune curled through the halls like smoke. An elderly boarder from the south wing froze in his chair when he heard it and whispered, "That's what they played when they took Richmond." No one had played it since. That night, Thomas was found digging behind the shed, saying he was trying to find where he left his boots. He had no boots. And when asked who told him to dig, he said, "The man with the red button on his collar." Another girl, Eliza, began braiding her hair into knots her mother didn't know how to undo. "My first mama taught me," she'd say, even though she'd only ever had one. She drew symbols into her porridge with the handle of her spoon and flinched every time the church bell rang, clutching her ears and crying, "That's not the right bell, it's too late now." The other children began speaking in sleep, not nightmares, but memories, names of places that hadn't existed in decades. One whispered Bell Hollow over and over again until Mrs. Grinnell pulled out an old map and found that Bell Hollow had been wiped away by a flood in 1796. Another child, no older than 5, corrected the pastor mid-sermon. "That's not what he said," the boy insisted. "He said we come back, but not always right." By the time the town doctor was called to examine them, he left pale and muttering, "It's not madness, it's memory." And then came the drawings. Children who couldn't read began sketching places with eerie accuracy, barns that had burned, parlors that no longer stood, wells sealed up long ago. One child drew a woman over and over again, black dress, veiled face, hands covered in soot. When asked, the child called her mother twice. No one could explain how these memories had bloomed in children too young to have them, or why their handwriting changed with each passing week, or why, when asked their names, some hesitated, like they were trying to remember which one to give. And late at night, the Grinnells could sometimes be heard pacing, not angry, not frightened, but tired, like people waiting for something they had lived through before, something coming again. Penrose had seen many family Bibles before, thick tomes passed through generations, heavy with ink and grief. But the one kept in the Grinnell home was unlike anything he had handled. It wasn't stored on a shelf or by the hearth, but in a locked drawer of the sewing room, wrapped in muslin, bound in what looked like dark hide rather than leather. It took him some time to realize the stitching along the spine wasn't factory threaded. Each page had been hand-bound, with red thread thick, almost waxy, and knotted, not at the end, but in the middle of each signature, as if to hold something in. He turned the pages slowly. The usual records were there at first: births, deaths, unions. But names repeated, not in the way families reuse a name after a generation. The same first name, the same middle, the same day of birth, written again years later in slightly different handwriting. Elias Martin Grinnell, born March the 4th, 1856. And then again, Elias Martin Grinnell, born March the 4th, 1863. It wasn't a clerical habit. Beneath each rebirth, in faint graphite or brown ink faded with time, a short note appeared, hard to read at first, hidden between the printed lines of the Bible. They were all written in the same hand, returned after 5 winters, eyes brighter this time. Still remembers the song, cried when he saw the river. We told him he drowned last time. Some notes were scratched out, almost violently. One read simply, "This one knows too much." And then a final line beneath, in different ink, "Do not name her again." Penrose felt the weight of the pages shift, as if they carried breath. Some had dried petals pressed between them, others what looked like flakes of ash. The last few pages were sewn shut entirely, not glued, but laced in a looping red thread so dense he could not see through it. He ran his fingers over the edge and felt something beneath, trapped between the stitched paper, a curve like bone, a scrap of fabric. He didn't cut the thread. He didn't have to, because in the margin, written sideways in small, deliberate hand, it said, "To open is to begin again." He closed the book carefully. Outside, the wind passed through the sycamores like it knew something had been found. The house didn't creak. It listened. When Penrose returned the book to the drawer, he noticed something else. A second muslin wrap, slightly smaller, resting beneath. Another book, or a body too small to forget. The Grinnells never mentioned the Bible, and Penrose never asked, but he kept a list of the names from memory. And when he returned home that winter, he found one of them already etched into his own family tree, crossed out, then written again, years later. The digging began just after dawn. The townspeople stood in a cautious circle, their boots crunching over frost-laced grass, breath fogging like ghosts between them. They had voted quietly, reluctantly, to exhume the grave of Elias Martin Grinnell, the first one, the one born in 1856, the one who, according to every telling, had died by fever before his 7th year. But something about the family Bible, the whispers, the drawings from the children who shouldn't have remembered, had soured their silence into curiosity, edged with dread. The gravedigger, now old and hunched like a question mark, was the same man who had buried that boy nearly 40 years ago. His hands shook more now, but his memory hadn't. "I dug this one deep," he said, voice low, deeper than usual. Was asked to. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the wood. The coffin, when exposed, was still intact, though the soil clung to it like wet skin. They pried it open gently, expecting dust, rot, a child's long-vanished bones. What they found instead was a second coffin, smaller, older, tucked beneath the first, like a secret, waiting to be remembered. The first box held a body. Small, preserved strangely well, as if time had been reluctant to claim it. A boy, arms crossed, mouth parted as though caught mid-thought. His nameplate read, Elias Martin Grinnell. The second coffin beneath, pressed directly into the earth, had no name at all, just a carved symbol, two intersecting circles, like a diagram or a knot. They hesitated before opening it. When they did, the crowd stepped back as one. Inside was another boy, the same face, same nose, same scar across the left brow, but different clothing hand-stitched, older style, mended at the shoulder. His hands were balled into fists. His eyes were closed, but his expression was not peaceful. It looked like grief or fury. Someone dropped their lantern. No one picked it up. The town physician, pale as the clouds overhead, muttered, "Identical, not similar, not related. Identical." The gravedigger crossed himself twice and whispered, "I only remember burying one." The mayor ordered the grave resealed before sunset. Said the second coffin was a mistake, a misrecorded twin, but there were no records of twins, only one child ever enrolled in school, only one seat, one name, one death, two burials. That night, a girl in town dreamed of digging. She said she saw more coffins, stacked like books, labeled with names she hadn't heard but somehow knew, and always, beside them, a woman in black, sewing something into her skirt pocket, thread red as blood, stitching a name into the hem over and over and over again. When asked what the name was, the girl said, "Elias, but it's not the last time." The midwife had not spoken in over 13 years, not since the night she walked barefoot out of the Grinnell house and into a thunderstorm without her shawl or her shoes. Her silence had turned into something sacred, a kind of boundary no one in town dared to cross. Until Penrose knocked on her door with a name and a question, and she let him in without a word. Her parlor was dim and heavy with dried herbs, the windows sealed tight against the autumn wind. She poured tea with hands that trembled only slightly, and spoke with a voice that had to be coaxed from somewhere deep inside her ribs. "I delivered all four," she said. "One in winter, two in summer, one on a day the birds wouldn't sing." She paused, eyes fixed on a crack in the floorboards. "But I only cut the cord 3 times." Penrose asked what she meant. The midwife didn't answer. Instead, she reached for a small tin box from a shelf and opened it slowly. Inside were scraps, ribbons of fabric stained with something dark, brittle bits of paper with names written in faded ink, and a child's tooth, wrapped carefully in muslin. She laid them out like cards in a reading. Each time, there was a voice. She whispered, not the mother's, not the father's, something older. It came from her mouth but didn't belong to her. Deep, dry, like wind through dead trees. "The first time," it said, "not this time. The second, he returns as promised." The third birth had been difficult hours of silence, then a sudden scream from the mother, followed by laughter that did not sound human. That voice had said, "He remembers the river." But it was the fourth birth that broke her. That one came quiet, too quiet. No crying, no breath. She thought the child was stillborn. But then the voice came again, and this time it said, "Bring him back, bring him back, bring him back." Over and over, the child gasped on the third repetition, "Alive," or something like it. Penrose listened without interrupting, his fingers clenched around his notebook but making no notes. "They were never new," she said. "None of them. They came with knowing in their eyes. They looked at me like they'd seen me before. She reached into the tin once more and handed him a scrap of paper. It was a torn corner of a page from a Bible, or maybe a ledger. On it was written a name, and next to it, the word, again. They think birth is a beginning, she said, eyes going glassy. But some doors only lead back in. Penrose left just before dusk. When he turned at the end of the path, her windows were dark. By morning, the midwife's house was empty. Not a single scrap remained. Only the smell of wet herbs and something else, something like cradle wood, burned and buried. The Grinnell parlor was lined with portraits, all carefully arranged in ornate frames that gleamed with years of polish and pride. Most visitors passed them by without notice, faces of ancestors, formal and forgettable, posing with the stillness expected of old photographs. But tucked into the back of a warped drawer in a hall cabinet, behind stacks of unopened letters and brittle lace handkerchiefs, was a photo album no one had seen before. It was thin, leather-bound, and oddly damp around the edges, as if it had sweated in the dark. Penrose turned the pages slowly. There were 4 photographs, each taken in what appeared to be the same room, the family sitting room, with its lace curtains and high-backed chairs. Each photo marked with a year: 1868, 1871, 1874, and 1877. The Grinnells were present in all 4, the mother, the father, and their son Elias. Same name each time, same eyes, same scar by the right temple. But in each image, Elias looked younger. In the first photo, he was perhaps 10, sharp-jawed, solemn, a boy who had already seen too much. In the second, he was 7, his shoes dangling above the floor. In the third, he was 5, round-cheeked and blinking, hair curlier. And in the fourth, he was no more than a toddler, sitting in his mother's lap, gazing directly into the lens, with an expression that didn't match his age. A deep, knowing look, tired, almost mournful. Penrose compared the mother and father in each photo. They aged as expected, creases deeper, eyes dimmer, posture more slouched. But not Elias. He unraveled, grew backward. The ink on the back of the photographs was the same handwriting, dated in the same slant. Our Elias, each one said. No mention of a second son, no indication of trickery. Just one child, retreating through time. He brought the album to the town printer, who confirmed the photos were authentic, not retouched. The chemicals matched their supposed eras. There was no evidence of composite. Whoever he is, the printer muttered, he was born more than once. Or maybe he never stopped being born. That night, Penrose laid the 4 photographs out on his desk and lit a single candle. As the flame flickered, he noticed something else, something subtle. Elias's eyes in the final photo reflected more light than the others. Not the light in the room, but something stronger. Something behind the photographer, behind the lens. A faint outline, a figure, tall, leaning forward, as though watching the boy from beyond the glass. And in the reflection of the boy's eye, it looked like he was smiling, but not with joy, with recognition, as if he'd done all of this before, and was waiting to do it again. The illness came quietly, not with fever or coughing, but with silence. One by one, the Grinnell children stopped speaking. Their mouths moved, but no sound followed. Their eyes grew vacant, fixed on corners of rooms where no one stood. They refused to eat, refused to sleep with the lamps out, and each morning they woke with dirt beneath their fingernails, though no one had seen them leave their beds. The town physician was summoned at last, an old man with steady hands and a sharpened instinct for when something wasn't natural. He examined the youngest first, Miriam, the girl with the doll made of hair, and gently parted her tangled curls. He froze. Behind her left ear, barely visible beneath the roots, was a mark. Not a bruise, not a wound. A symbol, a perfect circle, split through the center with a jagged line, like a cracked sun. He called for water, thinking it soot or ink, but it didn't wash away. He touched it with a cloth and felt the skin tighten beneath it. It was burned in, but the flesh hadn't blistered. There was no scarring. It was as if the symbol had always been there, waiting to be found. He checked the others. Elias had one, two, his just above the nape, beneath the part in his hair. Thomas, the quiet boy who never blinked, had one just over the crown of his head, hidden unless he bowed deeply. Each identical. Each burned, not carved. When asked, the children said nothing. They only hummed, low and tuneless, like wind through reeds. That night, the physician returned to his study, pulled every book on folklore and occult markings he owned, and searched until dawn. He found nothing exact, but came close. In an out-of-print volume on burial rites in the Appalachian Highlands, he found a sketch, not quite the same, but eerily familiar. A circle, a split. The text beneath it read, "Mark of the Returned." According to the book, this symbol was once burned onto the heads of children, believed to be twice-born souls that had died too soon, and clawed their way back through the womb. A taboo, even among those who believed in such things. A child who wore the mark was never baptized, never buried in church ground, because the old ones said they didn't belong fully to this world, that they were listening for a voice that would one day call them back. The physician closed the book. He sat in silence. He thought about the way the children stared into nothing, the way their bodies grew colder each week, though their pulses still beat. And he wondered not if they were dying, but if they had ever truly been born. It started just past midnight, when the bell in the chapel tower cracked clean down the middle, without wind or reason. Dogs howled in their yards, hens stirred without laying, and those awake swore the moon dimmed for a breathless second. Then came the fire. Not the angry orange of wood smoke, but a strange white blaze, blooming like a wound from within the Grinnell home. Flames licked the windows from the inside out, and yet the glass did not shatter. Curtains curled like dead leaves, walls breathed with heat, and in the nursery, seen by more than one witness, the 4 cradles rocked wildly as the blaze rose around them. But no children cried, no screams broke through, just the steady creak of the cradles, back and forth, even after the ceiling gave in. Townsfolk gathered in their nightclothes, buckets forgotten in hand, paralyzed by the unnatural silence. Mr. Hill, who lived across the lane, swore he saw the mother standing in the front parlor as the fire climbed her dress, only she did not move. She held something in her arms, wrapped in a shawl, and behind her, a man, the father, perhaps stood with his hands clasped, watching the watchers. Neither ran, neither shouted, just watched back. The house groaned. A muffled wail came from beneath the earth, not above, like something buried was screaming through soil. Then the nursery windows finally gave. Glass spilled into the garden, and with it came a sound like hundreds of rattles' bones. Some said, others, teeth. By the time the fire brigade arrived from the next town, there was nothing left to save. But even in the ash, there were no bodies. Not of the parents, not of the children, not even bones. Only the iron hooks where the cradles had once hung, still swinging slightly, untouched by heat. The ground beneath the nursery was later found blackened in a perfect circle, deeper than the rest. When they dug into it, they unearthed cloth, not burned, not frayed, but damp with something that smelled faintly of milk and rot. The town clerk attempted to mark the Grinnells as deceased, but couldn't. The death certificates required a cause, a witness, a body, and there was none. Just a house that had burned without burning down, just a family that vanished without walking away. In the days that followed, children across town began sleep-talking, each muttering the same phrase in different tongues. Translated, it meant, "They're not gone, just replanted." It had been nearly 12 years since the Grinnell house burned, and still the land refused to forget. Grass never quite took to the blackened soil, and even when children dared each other to run across the lot, they'd return pale, itchy, and quiet like something old had breathed on them. Most families moved on. Those who remained simply avoided the topic, avoided the name, avoided the graveyard, avoided the sound of wood creaking at night, until the stranger came. He appeared just before winter, walking the northern road into town with a handcart hitched behind him. The cart was odd, too large, too ornate for such a narrow road, its wheels not iron but carved of old cherry wood, worn yet strangely polished, as though it had been cared for through generations. Draped in black canvas and bound with fraying rope, it made no sound on the gravel, no rattle or clatter, only the whisper of wheels on dust. The man pushing it wore a long, weather-worn coat, buttoned to the throat, though the air was unseasonably warm. His hat was low, shadowing eyes that no one ever managed to describe. All anyone remembered was his mouth, which never smiled, never frowned, just rested in a soft, unreadable curve. And the sign he carried, antique cradles, each with a story, he set up beside the post office on a Wednesday. By Thursday, nearly every mother in town had passed by his cart. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an odd novelty. The cradles were carved, not manufactured, no two alike. Some had hearts etched into the sideboards, others had names scrawled beneath layers of peeling paint. One bore the shape of a sparrow, another the outline of a tiny lamb. But the names were what made people stop. Corinne, Ruth, Jonah, Elias, painted in soft, faded script across the base of each cradle. Names that hadn't been spoken in over a decade. Names pulled from fire-blackened graves and hushed whispers. Names no child in town had been allowed to say out loud since the night the house burned. Mothers stood in silence, gripping their children's hands too tight. One woman vomited in the street. Another fainted. The stranger said nothing. When asked where he got them, he simply tapped the side of the cart and said, "They come back." Some cradles had hair still caught in the joints. Others smelled faintly of milk. One had claw marks beneath the mattress board. No one could say why, but each cradle brought with it a feeling not of nostalgia, but recognition, like a door cracked open in the back of the mind, something forgotten, but never erased. A few townspeople, against their better judgment, bought one, curiosity, maybe, or guilt, or some unnameable pull. One couple placed theirs in the attic. That night, their son woke up screaming, insisting there was a girl in the cradle watching him. Another family found theirs rocking on its own, despite the windows being shut and no breeze in the house. A farmer claimed he saw his deceased daughter's reflection in the glass of one, staring up from inside the cradle like it was a mirror. The cradles never stayed still, never stayed quiet. They rocked, gently, deliberately, especially at night. Penrose, now much older and slower on his feet, returned to town after hearing rumors. He found the stranger packing up the last of the cart beneath the copper-colored sky of a dying afternoon. The historian asked his name. The man did not answer. He asked where he came from. Still, silence. Then Penrose asked one final question, the one that mattered. Why now? The man didn't look at him. Instead, he reached into the cart and pulled out one last cradle, smaller than the others. Blackened wood, nails hammered from the inside, burned scars along the edge. A single word carved beneath the base in shaking, childlike script. Still, the cradle was empty, and yet Penrose swore he heard something breathe. Before he could ask another question, the man turned, pushed the cart into the fog, rolling off the hills, and was gone. No tracks, no sound. Just the memory of wood on dust, and a name that no one dared say aloud anymore. But that night, a cradle rocked in a house that had never owned one, and somewhere, a child began whispering a name. They would not stop. It started small. A boy in the southern part of town began sitting up in his sleep, hands gripping his knees, swaying back and forth as if caught in a rhythm no one else could hear. His mother thought it was a dream, or maybe some new illness, until it happened again the next night, same time, same motion. Then her neighbor mentioned her daughter doing the same thing. And across town, another child. Then 3, then 7, always at night. Always at exactly 1 hour past midnight, rocking, whispering, staring forward with eyes that didn't seem to see the walls of their own homes, but something far beyond. They didn't speak during the day, didn't remember it. But each child whispered the same name when they rocked, soft, hoarse, as though pulled from the back of the throat after too many years of silence. Corinne. By the end of the week, more than a dozen families had reported it. Some tried medicine, others brought in priests. One woman tied her son's wrists to the bedposts. He bled through the ropes, but kept rocking, whispering, swaying until dawn. Then, without warning, the behavior stopped. For exactly one night, and on that night, every clock in town stopped at 1:13 in the morning. Not shattered, not drained of battery, just still. The air that night was colder than the season allowed. Animals refused to move, dogs growled into corners, roosters crowed too early, and the next morning, every child who had been rocking had a new mark at the nape of their neck, a faint red spiral, like something had been branded onto their skin using only breath. Penrose had stayed longer than intended. The stranger's cradle still haunted him. He hadn't slept, and when he did, his dreams were full of wet wood, shallow graves, and the sound of crying, not the loud, wailing cry of a baby, but the soft, desperate hiccups of something trying not to be heard. He visited one of the homes, spoke with a mother whose daughter now painted things no one could explain. "She draws trees," the woman whispered, "but the roots go the wrong way. Up, through the house, through the walls." Penrose asked to see one of the drawings. What she showed him made his throat go dry. It wasn't just a tree. It was the Grinnell property, reimagined in charcoal and ash, but unmistakable. And at the center was a cradle. Not drawn, but pressed burned into the paper, like it had been seared with heat. The mother said the girl hadn't used anything but a pencil. By now, the town had split into two. Half wanted to leave, half refused to believe, and at night the children kept rocking, in barns, in parlors, in their sleep, some, even while awake, mid-sentence, mid-bite. One child was found in the schoolhouse, staring into the corner of the coat room, arms wrapped around herself, humming a lullaby from over a century ago. Her teacher swore she had never taught it. A local historian verified the tune, an Appalachian cradle song lost since the 1850s. The girl was 6. The rocking wasn't random. It came in waves. Whole neighborhoods one night, silent the next, and the whispers grew clearer. Not just Corinne now, other names, familiar ones. Ruth, Jonah, Elias. Each name a stone turned over in the town's collective memory, each one tied to a grave that should have held still. Parents tried burning the drawings, cutting the hair of the children, sealing their rooms with salt. Nothing worked. Some children disappeared. Not stolen, not dead, just gone. One boy was last seen sitting in his cradle by the fire. When his mother returned, the cradle was empty and rocking gently. There were no footprints, no open windows, just the echo of creaking wood. Penrose returned to the Grinnell lot. The foundation was still scorched, but new footprints were there, small, bare, leading into the center of the ruins, where no one should have stepped. At the center, in the dirt, was a fresh outline drawn in chalk, a spiral, and at the end of it, a name. Not one of the children, not one from any record, just 3 letters. Wren. He didn't understand it then, but that name would come again. That night, every cradle in town rocked on its own. No wind, no sound, just motion. Slow, deliberate, as though waiting. And somewhere in the hills, someone sang. It began with a drawing found tucked inside the church's offering box. No one saw who placed it there. The paper was stiff with soot, edges curled inward as if it had survived fire or been drawn in one. The pastor's wife, thinking it was a child's scribble, opened it. What she found made her sit down right there on the floor. A map. Crude but unmistakably detailed, it showed the town as it had once been before the fire, before the graves, before the cradles. But then came the strange part. It didn't stop. The map stretched past the river, through the forest, into the marsh, past where the roads were supposed to end, and there, etched faintly in the corner, was a symbol, a spiral, like a fingerprint unraveling. It wasn't just a map. It was a guide, a warning, a continuation. Within the week, 5 more drawings surfaced, one hidden inside the schoolhouse ledger, one beneath the altar cloth, one tucked inside the old town physician's journal, though no one had opened it in decades. The last 2 were the strangest. One was found buried in the soil of a newly planted grave. The other was discovered behind the mirror in the old Grinnell home, though it had been reduced to ash long ago. The mirror had no business being intact, no frame, no backing, just a shard lodged into scorched brick, reflecting a wall that wasn't there. Each drawing bore the same initials in the corner, A, W. No one in town recognized the signature, but Penrose did. Annalise Ward, the orphan who vanished after Fogwood burned, the girl who drew impossible maps, the child whose visions unearthed bones, houses, and forgotten histories. He hadn't heard her name in years, but she was always in the back of his mind, especially after he visited that final hollow beneath the hill, where the bed was still warm and a candle still smoked. He began connecting the new drawings to her old ones. It fit too well to be coincidence, but there was a change in tone now, less like memory, more like a route. The maps weren't just of what was they were, of what was coming. And what terrified him most wasn't that she had returned, it was that she had never left. Children began drawing again, without prompting, without knowing why. They used coal, mud, blood. Some even scratched patterns into the frost on windows. Parents dismissed it as imagination until the drawings began to repeat across homes. Identical. Exact. One mother burned her daughter's sketch and later found it redrawn on the back of her own wedding portrait. One father banned paper and found the spiral carved into his barn door. Always the same lines, the same marks, the same name, A. W. But it wasn't just her anymore. The cradles had stopped. The children no longer rocked. They watched, now quiet, still, eyes reflecting things that weren't in the room. Penrose kept every new drawing, plotted them, followed the trail. The deeper he went, the more he understood. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was a direction, a descent, a way inward, not into earth, but into memory. Ancestral, collective, stitched into the blood like thread. The children weren't haunted, they were remembering. One final letter arrived on Penrose's desk. No stamp, no sender. Inside, one last drawing. A house with no windows, no doors, no roof. Just a cradle in the center, and beneath it, a root system shaped like veins. He turned the paper over. 3 words were written in ash. She's still drawing. Somewhere in the hills, another child begins sketching. Her name is Wren. She doesn't speak, but her hands never stop moving. And when asked what she's drawing, she simply points down. The map never ends. If this story haunted you, you're not alone. These tales always find their way back. Comment the oldest town in your country. And if you want more stories that whisper long after the screen goes dark, like and subscribe to The Black Chapter.